Picture this. London, 1836. Caroline Norton is 28 years old, beautiful, witty, and a celebrated writer. Her words fill the salons of the capital. Politicians admire her essays. Artists paint her portrait. She seems untouchable. And then, with a stroke of law, she vanishes. Not her body, her legal existence. Because Caroline has just married George Norton. And under the doctrine of coverture, marriage isn't a union. It's an erasure. But before we step into the drawing rooms of Victorian London, where respectability was a mask and law itself became a weapon to cage women, take a moment to subscribe and tap that like button. If you're drawn to history's hidden cruelties, to the silenced voices behind polished facades, then you're exactly where you should be. And tell me in the comments, where in the world you're watching from. Now let's rewind to how Caroline Norton's nightmare began. For Caroline Norton, the shock was profound. She had grown up privileged, educated, admired. Marriage to George seemed respectable. Instead, she found herself trapped with a violent, jealous husband who wielded the law like a club. When she separated from him, she discovered the truth. She couldn't take her children. She couldn't touch her earnings. She couldn't defend herself in court. Her husband had become her legal identity. And she had become nothing. Think about this, if a woman with fame, beauty, and powerful friends could be legally erased, what chance did anyone else have? If you're hearing this and you don't hit subscribe, ask yourself, are you any different from the crowds who looked away in silence? Caroline wasn't alone. Across Britain, millions of women lived under the same invisible noose. A factory worker in Lancashire might work 12-hour days spinning cotton, but her pay packet went straight into her husband's hands. A wealthy heiress might inherit a fortune, but the moment she married, her husband controlled it. A mother might carry and raise her children, but if her husband chose, he could sell their apprenticeships to factories or mines without her consent. From paupers to aristocrats, marriage was a trap. Where did this come from? It stretched back centuries, into Norman law, feudal customs, and patriarchal theology. The husband was lord of the household, a king in his castle. Coverture simply gave that custom the weight of statute. To medieval jurists, it made sense. One household, one legal will. But by the 19th century, it was absurd. Industrial capitalism needed women as workers. Literature needed women as authors. Society praised women as moral guardians. Yet the law still treated them as shadows. And yet, even under erasure, some women found ways to fight back. Caroline Norton, using her pen as her only weapon, began writing scathing pamphlets and petitions. She demanded reform of child custody laws. She exposed the cruelty of coverture not just as personal tragedy, but as national shame. In 1839, partly because of her relentless campaigning, Parliament passed the Custody of Infants Act, the first crack in the legal fortress. It allowed mothers, in limited cases, to petition for custody of children under 7. A tiny step, but a step nonetheless. Caroline called it the first recognition that a mother is something more than a mere nurse to her children. Her victory was partial, fragile, and costly. She remained legally dependent on George for years. Her reputation was savaged. Her sons were used as pawns. Her life, in many ways, was ruined. And she was one of the lucky ones. She had wealth, wit, and connections. For the majority of women, working class, voiceless, illiterate, there was no platform, no pamphlet, no parliament to listen. For them, coverture wasn't an argument. It was reality. A daily, grinding cage disguised as marriage. This is just the beginning of the story. Coverture was the foundation, the legal skeleton. But what flesh grew on those bones was far darker. Because the law didn't just erase women on paper. It gave husbands license to control their wives' bodies, to commit violence without consequence, and to turn the home into a theater of fear. License to control their wives' bodies. Yes, you heard that right. If that sentence shook you, it should. Because ignoring this makes us no better than Victorians who praised the angel of the house while ignoring the bruises. Subscribe now, or if you won't, At least drop a comment explaining why you'd rather stay blind to history's darkest truth. Close your eyes and picture this. A narrow townhouse in London, gas lamps flickering against the fog. The parlor filled with polished furniture, lace curtains, and the portrait of a smiling family above the mantel. Respectable, proper, safe. But step through the bedroom door, and you see the truth. A man, legally master of the house, raising his hand against his wife. The blows echo off the walls. She cries out, "The neighbors hear." And the law does nothing. This is not a scandal. It's not a crime. It is his right. Wait, back up for a second. A man could legally beat his wife, rape her, lock her away, and society applauded him. If you can listen to that and scroll past without subscribing, history will repeat itself while you stay silent. Which are you, silent or witness? For centuries, English common law tolerated wife-beating as discipline. The infamous rule of thumb, the claim that a husband could strike his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb, captures the spirit, even if its origins are debated. The point wasn't the stick. It was the principle. The husband ruled the body of his wife. Courts intervened only if excessive cruelty threatened her life. Short of that, it was a private matter, protected by the sanctity of marriage. And remember, marriage was forever. Divorce was almost impossible. To leave meant ruin. To stay meant surviving blows in silence. But bruises and broken bones were only one part of the prison. The law went further. It reached into the most intimate part of a woman's existence, her own body. In the eyes of the courts, a wife's body was not hers to protect. It was his to use. Always. Marital rape didn't exist as a crime. It didn't even exist as an idea. Because marriage itself was defined as permanent consent. One 18th century judge put it in words as cold as iron. The husband cannot be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract the wife hath given herself up. Given herself up, entirely. Irrevocably. Forever. And what did that mean in practice? It meant pregnancies that never ended. Bodies worn down before their time. Injuries suffered in silence. And the crushing truth that a woman's body was never her own, not for a single day after the vows were spoken. Consider the case of Lady Colin Campbell, a glamorous aristocrat in the late 19th century. She accused her husband of cruelty, venereal disease, and abuse. The trial became a sensation, splashed across newspapers. But the law wasn't on her side. Her accusations were twisted into evidence of her own supposed immorality. The court portrayed her not as a victim, but as a hysterical woman trying to smear her noble husband. She lost. Her reputation was destroyed. And society whispered that she was the scandal, not him. Now shift your gaze to the working class. In 1853, a woman named Hannah Millins was sentenced for stabbing her violent husband in self-defense. The judge thundered that her act threatened the very order of society. For fighting back, she faced penal servitude. The message was clear: the husband's violence was discipline. The wife's resistance was crime. It wasn't just the drawing rooms of London. Across Lancashire and Manchester, inspectors recorded brutal scenes in the factory districts. Women with blackened eyes hiding beneath bonnets. Mothers carrying infants while dodging fists. Wives locked in cellars for disobedience. Respectability offered no protection. Poverty only made it worse. Why did society tolerate this? Because the law wrote it into silence. Wives could not testify against husbands in criminal trials. Marriage made them legally one. Police rarely interfered in domestic quarrels. Even neighbors, hearing screams through the walls, shrugged. It was none of their business. And if a woman fled, she had no wages, no property, no custody of her children. She might end up in the workhouse, or worse, in prostitution, branded forever as fallen. For many, staying seemed the only choice. Here's the irony: Victorian culture idolized the family home as a moral sanctuary. The angel of the house was praised in poetry and sermons as pure, virtuous, uplifting. Husbands were celebrated as benevolent patriarchs. But behind closed doors, countless homes were cages of fear. The more respectable the household, the harder it was to pierce the mask. Who would believe a countess? Who would defend a factory wife? The silence was suffocating. Not everyone stayed silent. Frances Power Cobb, a pioneering writer and reformer, began publishing essays on wife torture in England. She exposed case after case of battered women, drawing a direct line between coverture and cruelty. If a wife was legally absorbed into her husband, she argued, then of course he felt entitled to her body, her labor, her obedience. Cobb's words shocked polite society. But they also sparked outrage, not at the men, but at her. Many accused her of exaggeration, of trying to destroy the sacred image of the family. Sound familiar? Calling out abuse was seen as the real crime. For women trapped in violent marriages, the cruelty wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Imagine knowing that no matter what happened, the law stood behind your abuser. Every door you tried was locked. Every path to escape ended in disgrace. Even your children could be used as weapons against you. That sense of futility broke many long before the bruises did. So when we speak of Victorian marriage as a domestic hell, it's not a metaphor. It's a legal reality. Violence normalized as discipline. Rape legalized as marital duty. Silence enforced by coverture. Escape is punished as a crime. It wasn't just individual cruelty. It was a system. But here's the grim twist. This was only one layer of the trap. Because even for women who avoided the worst violence, the very act of motherhood became a snare. Pregnancy wasn't just a duty. It was a danger. Childbirth killed thousands. Laws stripped mothers of custody. And children themselves became commodities, sold into labor, exploited by fathers, erased from their mother's arms. The law said a wife belonged to her husband. But what about her children? Here's the brutal truth. They weren't hers either. For a Victorian wife, motherhood wasn't just expected, it was unavoidable. Birth control was scarce, unreliable, and often illegal. Respectable society treated contraception as obscene. Doctors, clergymen, and lawmakers all agreed, a wife's duty was to provide heirs, workers, and soldiers. But the cost was staggering. Childbirth killed women in numbers that rivaled war. Infection, hemorrhage, exhaustion. In an age before antiseptics and reliable obstetrics, every pregnancy was a gamble with death. One mid-19th century physician admitted bluntly, "A married woman lives in a state of perpetual violation and perpetual peril." And yet, the expectation never wavered. If a wife died in labor, another woman could replace her. If she survived, she might face the cycle again within months. Even if she survived, even if she endured, her children weren't hers. Under English law, paternal custody was absolute. The father could take the children from their mother at any age, send them to boarding school without her consent, apprentice them into factories or mines for wages, forbid her from seeing them entirely. Caroline Norton knew this agony. When she left her abusive husband, George Norton, he retaliated by seizing their 3 sons. She wrote bitterly, "The English law takes the baby from the breast of the mother and gives it to the man who may ill-use her." Caroline Norton's pleas shook Parliament, but only just. Out of her suffering came the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, a reform so small it was almost an insult. Mothers could now petition for custody of children under 7. Petition. Not claim. Not secure. Beg. And even then, the court decided if she was morally fit. One whispered rumor of impropriety, one accusation whispered in a drawing room, and the child could be snatched back again. For working-class mothers, the cruelty looked different, but it cut just as deep. Children weren't heirs, they were assets. Fathers could sell their sons and daughters into labor as easily as selling livestock. The 1842 Mines Report put it in black and white. Girls as young as 8, bent double in the dark, hauling coal through tunnels for 12 hours a day. Inspectors wrote of mothers weeping as their husbands signed the contracts. Women forced to watch, powerless to stop it. And here's the truth, it wasn't just poverty driving this. It was law. The father's word was final. His command overrode her tears, her protests, even her very motherhood. Think about that. Her body wasn't her own. Her children weren't her own. Even her grief was treated as rebellion, as disobedience against the man the law called her master. A wife could nurse an infant at her breast, rock a toddler to sleep, wipe the fever from a child's forehead, and still know that, at any moment, the law could rip them away. This wasn't just a domestic struggle. It was a deliberate design, to keep women compliant by making their greatest love their greatest vulnerability. Cycles only break when people refuse to look away. If you won't subscribe, then comment right now and tell us why, because silence is exactly what let these women be erased for centuries. Medicine, instead of offering relief, often deepened the trap. Male doctors dismissed women's pain in childbirth as natural suffering. Complaints of exhaustion, pelvic injury, or postpartum depression were brushed aside. Some physicians even argued that pain in labor was a divine punishment for Eve's sin, an argument straight from Genesis used to justify inaction. When women sought contraception, doctors scolded them. When they sought abortions, they were criminalized. When they collapsed from endless pregnancies, they were diagnosed as hysterical and confined to bed. In other words, medicine didn't just fail mothers. It policed them. Motherhood should have been a source of joy, protection, and identity. Instead, under Victorian law, it was a double bondage. The physical peril of endless pregnancies. The emotional torment of knowing children could be taken away. It is hard to overstate the cruelty of this system. A wife's body produced heirs for her husband's line, and her children secured his legacy. She was the vessel, not the parent. As one critic put it, a woman may bring 10 children into the world, and yet the law will not allow her even the guardianship of their persons. Of course, not every woman accepted this quietly. Caroline Norton fought. Other campaigners joined her, pressing for reforms in custody law and maternal rights. But victories were partial, slow, and hard-won. Most mothers remained trapped, forced to smile in public while grieving in private. Some turned to underground networks of women who hid fugitives and smuggled letters to children. Others poured their pain into diaries and novels, stories that hinted at the silent epidemic of maternal despair. And some, too many, broke entirely. Death in childbirth, suicide after losing custody, collapse under endless pregnancies. Their names rarely reached the newspapers. This was the trap of motherhood in Victorian England. Pregnancy demanded, contraception forbidden. Birth dangerous, medicine indifferent. Children born, custody denied. Love deepened, law betrayed. It was a cycle engineered to keep women compliant, their most natural bond turned into their greatest vulnerability. And yet, this wasn't the end of their imprisonment. Because even beyond motherhood, another chain bound wives to their husbands: money. Property, wages, inheritance, business, all of it disappeared into a husband's pocket. Even the rare woman who managed to earn her own living was still legally working for someone else. When a Victorian wife woke in the morning and went to work, whether scrubbing floors, running a shop counter, or even writing novels, the law was waiting at the end of the day. Her wages, her profits, her inheritance, her property, all belonged to her husband. It wasn't theft. It wasn't corruption. It was the law. Take the case of a Lancashire cotton worker in the 1840s. She stands 12 hours a day in a roaring mill, lungs full of dust, arms aching from spinning frames. At the end of the week, she collects her pay packet. But the moment she enters her home, her husband is waiting. Legally, he doesn't even need to snatch it from her hand. It's already his. If she hides a shilling to buy bread or coal, she risks punishment not just as a wife but as a thief. Because under coverture, a wife stealing from her husband was like a man stealing from himself. The injustice reached far beyond wages. Ellen Woodhouse, for example, ran a small but thriving dressmaking business. Her husband, James, forced her to sign over the shop's accounts. When he drank away the profits, creditors pursued her, but she had no legal standing to fight back. Or Mary Jane Turner, who inherited a modest estate from her father. Upon her marriage, the entire inheritance automatically transferred to her husband. Within a year, he had mortgaged it, squandered the income, and left her destitute. Mary Jane remained legally bound to him, unable to reclaim a penny. In both cases, the law didn't merely fail to protect these women. It actively armed their husbands against them. This wasn't accidental. It was policy by design. By denying wives financial independence, the law ensured obedience. A woman who couldn't hold property or keep wages couldn't leave. Even if her marriage was violent, degrading, or loveless, escape meant starvation. And society reinforced it. Respectable families told their daughters, "Marry well." Why? Because once married, a woman's survival depended entirely on her husband's goodwill. What about divorce? Surely a woman could free herself that way? Hardly. Before 1857, divorce required a private act of parliament, something only the wealthiest could afford. After the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, ordinary people could file, but the law was stacked against women. A husband could divorce a wife for adultery alone. A wife had to prove adultery plus cruelty, incest, bigamy, or desertion. Legal fees were crushing, often equal to years of wages. So while men could cast off wives with relative ease, women remained chained. Divorce wasn't liberation. It was another arena where gender dictated the rules. For working-class wives, the situation was even more brutal. Many couldn't imagine paying lawyers or court fees. Leaving meant entering the workhouse, a grim fate where families were separated, labor was harsh, and stigma was lifelong. In practice, this meant countless women endured abuse in silence. Poverty wasn't an accident of the system. It was the weapon that kept them compliant. Among the wealthy, things looked different but were no less cruel. Aristocratic women brought dowries into marriage, sometimes enormous sums. But the moment vows were exchanged, those fortunes became the husband's to spend. And he did. Horses, mistresses, gambling tables. The estate of the wife's family might be stripped bare by a careless husband, while she remained powerless to intervene. The theft was perfectly respectable, because it wore the mask of marriage. By mid-century, campaigners began to gather statistics. Reports revealed thousands of women petitioned Parliament about lost wages and seized inheritances. Court records overflowed with cases where husbands mortgaged wives' property without consent. Economic abuse wasn't rare, it was routine. And when critics argued that men were simply misusing the law, reformers replied, "No. The law itself is a misuse." Some Victorians argued that men were natural providers. Husbands would, in theory, use their wives' money to care for the family. But reality was different. A husband could drink away wages in taverns while his wife pawned furniture to feed the children. He could gamble fortunes while she stitched clothes late into the night. And when wives complained, society scolded them for being ungrateful. After all, they had chosen their husbands. In truth, the system encouraged dependency and punished initiative. If a wife earned too much, she was seen as unfeminine. If she tried to control her money, she was seen as rebellious. If she submitted, she was poor. If she resisted, she was punished. By the 1850s, the absurdity became harder to ignore. Pamphleteers and campaigners demanded change. Caroline Norton, still fighting after losing her children, published essays exposing how men ruined wives financially. Other activists pointed to cases like Ellen Woodhouse and Mary Jane Turner, insisting the law robbed women not only of dignity but of survival. Pressure mounted. Finally, Parliament responded. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 granted wives the right to keep wages they earned and property they inherited. But think about the timeline: thousands of years of marriage customs, centuries of common law, decades of protest, all just to win the right to control your own paycheck. Even with reforms on the horizon, the damage had been done. Generations of women had been taught that their money, their homes, even their labor didn't belong to them. That lesson seeps deep. It trains you to believe you're a dependent, a guest in your own house, a trespasser in your own shop. It turns poverty into policy, not by accident, but by design. The financial trap was just one more layer in the cage. First the law erased wives. Then violence disciplined them. Then motherhood bound them. And money sealed the door. But there was still another force waiting in the wings, one that gave the system the illusion of science. Doctors, psychiatrists, and surgeons would cloak control in the language of medicine. They would diagnose rebellion as hysteria, ambition as madness, and grief as insanity. Mussolini ruled Rome with shame. But Victorian England had its own empire of control, cloaked not in scandal, but in science. By the mid-19th century, medicine had become the new priesthood. White-coated, learned men with stethoscopes and surgical knives carried authority greater than many judges. They claimed to speak not just for health, but for truth itself. And when they looked at women, they didn't see citizens. They saw problems to be managed. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of the most celebrated psychiatrists of the Victorian age, looked at women and saw not potential, but pathology. He declared that women were biologically unfit for intellectual labor. Study, ambition, even the simple act of reading novels, he warned, could shrivel their reproductive organs and doom them as mothers. To resist domestic life wasn't independence. It was sickness. And then came Dr. William Acton, who pushed the cruelty even further. He insisted that most women felt no desire at all, that they were naturally passionless creatures, built solely for reproduction and service. And if a woman dared to show passion, or worse, to claim her right to pleasure, that wasn't love. That was deviance. The message was unmistakable. Obedience was health. Resistance was madness. And with medicine on their side, men gained a weapon sharper than any cane or whip. Under Victorian lunacy laws, a husband needed only the signatures of 2 doctors to have his wife locked away in an asylum. 2 pens on paper, and her life was gone. And the diagnoses? Conveniently vague. Hysteria. Melancholia. Excessive imagination. Even novel reading. Respectable wives found themselves locked behind iron bars not for madness, but for defiance. Rosina Bulwer-Lytton, estranged wife of the novelist and politician Edward Bulwer-Lytton, was publicly declared insane and confined when she dared to criticize him. Her illness was nothing more than political embarrassment. And she wasn't alone. Advocacy groups like the alleged Lunatics' Friends Society fought to free countless women committed under flimsy pretexts. But for many, once the asylum door shut, it never reopened. If the asylum was one cage, the surgical theatre was another. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, a London gynecological surgeon, believed female disobedience stemmed from sexual excess. His cure? Clitoridectomy, surgical removal of the clitoris. He performed it routinely, often without consent, claiming it relieved hysteria, epilepsy, and rebellion. The procedure mutilated women permanently, erasing both pleasure and, in many cases, health. For years, the medical establishment looked away, some even applauding his work. Only when scandal erupted in the late 1860s was Baker Brown expelled from the obstetrical society. But by then, countless women had been cut in the name of science. For those not locked away or mutilated, another treatment awaited, enforced rest. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell in America, echoed by British physicians, prescribed the rest cure for women suffering from depression, exhaustion, or intellectual ambition. The regimen was simple: isolation, bed rest, overfeeding, and a ban on reading, writing, or creative work. It was a sentence of silence. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, subjected to this treatment, later turned her horror into the famous story The Yellow Wallpaper. In it, a woman locked in her bedroom for rest slowly descends into madness, her mind unraveling while her husband insists it's for her health. The story wasn't fantasy. It was testimony. What tied all these practices together wasn't just cruelty, it was language. Doctors cloaked domination in the rhetoric of health. Surgeons called mutilation a cure. Psychiatrists called confinement treatment. Physicians called enforced obedience therapy. Just as coverture erased women in law, science erased them in biology. Resistance was pathologized. Suffering was naturalized. Control was rationalized. This wasn't a conspiracy of individuals. It was a system, a collaboration between law, medicine, and society to keep women compliant under the guise of progress. And yet, even here, cracks began to form. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first female doctor in Britain, exposed the hypocrisies of male-dominated medicine. Elizabeth Wolstenholme, radical reformer, argued that coverture and medical tyranny were two sides of the same coin. Campaigners rallied around cases like Rosina Bulwerlytten's, demanding reform in asylum law. Even literature became a weapon. Novels, essays, and pamphlets carried women's testimonies where the courts would not. Step by step, the silence was broken. By the 1870s and 1880s, a new generation was watching. Emmeline Pankhurst, future leader of the suffragettes, grew up in a household steeped in reformist ideas. The abuses of coverture, the stories of wrongful confinement, the humiliations of medicine, all of it planted seeds that would bloom into political revolt. The fight for the vote, for equal property rights, for bodily autonomy, these battles didn't emerge from nowhere. They were born in the ashes of women like Caroline Norton, Rosina Bulwerlytten, and countless nameless wives who suffered in silence. But victory was never simple. Women who resisted paid dearly. Caroline Norton lost her children. Rosina was branded insane. Gilman's story nearly ended her career. Wolstenholme was scorned as radical. For every name history remembers, thousands remain forgotten, women beaten into silence, locked in asylums, mutilated in operating theaters, or buried in childbirth graves. That silence is part of the story too. And here's the haunting part. Though laws changed, though reforms came, the logic of the system didn't vanish. Language still disguises abuse. Medicine still sometimes polices rather than heals. Power still cloaks itself in respectability. The ghost of coverture lingers, not in the statute books, but in the structures of power that continue to shape lives. So what do we make of this? Victorian marriage was not just a private arrangement. It was a political institution, a machine built to erase women legally, control them physically, exploit them economically, and silence them medically. It was a cage with many locks. Law, violence, motherhood, poverty, science. Each one reinforced the others. Each one disguised itself as natural, respectable, or inevitable. And yet, women resisted. With pens, with protests, with whispers across parlor tables and factory floors. They cracked the locks, one by one. If you scroll past this without subscribing, you've chosen silence, the same silence that let Messalina's tragedy happen. They killed her twice, first in life, then by burying her story. Don't be like the neighbors who shut their doors when her screams filled the night. Hit subscribe, or drop a comment explaining why her story doesn't deserve to be heard.